morning, everyone, and thank you for your participation in this conference. I introduce myself. I'm Chiara Baldi. I'm a journalist from the daily newspaper La Stampa. And today we're going to introduce and present the WeWorld Index 2020 Women and Children in Times of Covid-19. The day will be divided into 3 moments. We have an opening speech that will be given by WeWorld, in particular from Marco Chiesara, the president, and Elena Carva, who is one of the curators. Then we have a panel discussion with 4 participants, 4 guests. We have Mr. Mathieu Brossard from the UNICEF, Mrs. Tiziana Clerico from the UNHCR. Then we have from Ramallah, Refat Sabah from the Global Campaign for Education, and Mrs. Meg Gardiner from the Child Fund Alliance, and she's now in New York. Last but not least, we have also the speech of Mrs. Emanuela Del Re. She is the Italian Vice Minister of Foreign Affairs and International Cooperation, so we thank her a lot. And before we start, I would like to remind you that it's possible to follow this conference on the WeWorld social media account, and it is also possible that you tweet with the hashtag WeWorld Index 2020. At the end of the day, we collect some of the questions from the public to ask the question to our guests. So thank you very much, and let's start with the opening speech from Marco Chiesara, the president of the WeWorld GBC Onlus. Marco, hi, good evening. I would like to ask you, since 2015, you made this publication of the index. I have 2 questions for you. Which are the main objectives of this series? And starting from the new of this year, so the fact that you joined the Child Fund Alliance, I would like to ask you if you can tell us something more about this new partnership.
Thank you, Chiara, and good afternoon to everyone. First of all, let me thank all of you for being here today at the presentation of the 6th edition of the WeWorld Index. In particular, I'd like to thank the Ministry of Foreign Affairs and International Cooperation for renewing its patronage for this event. And I'm really glad to have here today with us Ms. Emanuela Del Re, Vice Minister of Foreign Affairs and International Cooperation. I want also to thank, of course, Chiara Baldi, our moderator, and all the panelists, Ms. Tiziana Clerico, Ms. Meg Gardiner, Mr. Refat Sabah, and Mr. Mathieu Brossard. The WeWorld Index 2020 has some new features compared to the previous editions, but the goal for which it was first conceived in 2015 still stands: to measure the inclusion of women and children in 172 countries around the world, considering inclusion as a multidimensional process affecting various aspects of life, in line with the 2030 agenda. In this new edition, we decided to focus more on the deep connection between women's and children's well-being, reporting many concrete examples. Also, the WeWorld Index 2020 provides a snapshot of the world in times of COVID-19, an event that has deeply destabilized all countries, and especially the most vulnerable categories, again, women and children. In such a difficult moment at a global level, we believe it is increasingly necessary to work in a synergic way, joining forces on the common ground of human rights and the fight against injustices. This is why we are glad to announce that we recently joined Child Fund Alliance as its 12th member. And this is the reason why I am particularly happy to have here with us Meg Gardiner. WeWorld currently operates 158 projects in 27 countries, directly improving lives of 7 million beneficiaries and indirectly supporting 42 million children, women, and families. Child Fund operates in more than 60 countries to help nearly 16 million children and families around the world. The Alliance members work to secure children's rights and violence and exploitation against children and overcome poverty and the underlying conditions preventing children from achieving their full potential. The decision to join Child Fund Alliance is an important step following the merger between WeWorld and GVC in 2018. It provides an opportunity for us to be more effective in fighting for people's rights. Also, becoming a member of Child Fund Alliance increases our ability to support more communities in more countries around the world. Our commitment in the fight for rights in Italy and globally is growing with new ways and opportunities to fight injustice without leaving anyone behind. In Child Fund, we found the alliance we were looking for its ability to work around the world, both on the field and in the policy arena, with methodologies and visions in common with ours. So now let me pass the floor to Elena Caneva, WeWorld Advocacy Coordinator, who will go through the Index 2020. Thank you to everyone and good job.
Thank you, Marco, and welcome to everybody. In my speech today, I'll start by describing how the WeWorld Index is constructed. Then I'll move on to some of the main results of this edition index. And finally, I give you some information about the focus of this edition, that is education in times of COVID-19. First of all, I'd like to tell you something about the index. The index was elaborated by WeWorld in 2015 to measure the inclusion of women and children around the world. The WeWorld Index has some peculiarities in our opinion. First of all, in the index, inclusion is considered as a multidimensional concept. As Marco said before, in our index and in line with the 2030 agenda, inclusion concerns not only the economic sphere, but also the social and environmental spheres. And secondly, another peculiarity of the WeWorld Index is that it considers women's rights intertwined with the children's rights. So, if we promote women's inclusion, we consequently promote children inclusion and vice versa. Another interesting features of this edition is that in this edition we underline the necessity to reinforce not only legal tools which promotes children's and women's rights. Legal tools such as the Convention on the Right of the Child or the Convention on all discrimination against women are fundamental, but they are not enough. They are a framework, a legal framework in which to act, but to be able to truly exercise their right, women and children must be in the condition to implement their right. In other words, they must have capabilities, where capabilities are understood as the possibilities of being free, of choosing according to one's aspiration and values. So it is important to promote the development of children's and women capabilities. It is not enough to promote them by legal tools. And the acquisition of capabilities has to be promoted in 4 areas. We call it these 4 areas the 4 building blocks, and they are education, health, economy, and society, as you can see by these slides. So, promoting the development of capabilities in these 4 areas is important, is fundamental, but it is also important to consider the influence of the context, of the environmental and cultural context, because all these processes occurs in an environmental and cultural context, and they are influenced by it. So this is another important point to take into account. How the WeWorld Index is constructed. This year, in addition to the 34 indicators we usually use to construct the index, we added 3 new indicators in order to take into consideration the effect of the pandemic. These 3 indicators are related to 3 important dimensions: health, but also economy and education. All the 34 indicators plus 3 new indicators are aggregated together by a statistical procedure, and the final result is the WeWorld Index. The final result is a ranking of the countries of the world based on the synthesis of these 34 indicators. In this slide, you can see the list of dimensions which compose the WeWorld Index. For every dimension, we choose 2 indicators. What about the result of this edition? As you can see, the world is divided in 5 groups according to the level of inclusion of women and children around the world. You can find in colored in green, in 2 types of green, those countries where inclusion of women and children is best. At the top of the WeWorld Index ranking, there is Norway, followed by Sweden, Iceland, and Finland. Whereas at the bottom of the ranking, we find all African countries, particularly countries situated in the Sahel zone, plus 2 Asian countries, Yemen and Afghanistan. Every year we divided the ranking into these 5 groups according to the level of inclusion of women and children. And in the 2020 edition, we can say that 2 countries out of 3 don't assure a decent life for women and children. As you can see from this table, the countries where women and children suffer very severe forms of exclusion or severe form of exclusion or insufficient inclusion are 110. So a lot of countries in the world. And finally, another result that I'd like to highlight here is that compared to the previous edition of the WeWorld Index, this year we registered a global worsening of women and children inclusion around the world, probably due to the pandemic, also to the pandemic. But what we want to highlight is that the impact will be stronger for those countries already situated at the bottom of the WeWorld Index ranking, because they are countries already affected by other crises, for example, humanitarian crises, conflict, wars, authoritarian governments, climate change, and so on. So we are expecting that in these countries, the inclusion of women, the exclusion, in this case, of women and children worsened in the long run, in the next years. Going to the focus of this edition, education in times of COVID-19. We all know that the pandemic has affected and is still affecting many spheres of our lives. Health, but also economy, social relation, and so on, and in particular education. So in spring 2020, most governments around the world decided to close schools and to implement a distance learning program. According to data, over 91% of the world's student population stayed at home. But internet connection, as we know, is not available at in the same way in different geographical areas and for different social categories. And in fact, in the case of children, using internet connection worsened inequalities between children. The pandemic affected children's education, but also families, communities, and societies. Think about the role of schools in some context. In some context, school is a mean to protect children from various forms of violence. For example, early marriage, forced marriage, child labor, and so on. In other contexts, schools provide meals for poor children. So it has an educational role, but it is also a protective school, a protective environment. So it is very important. And the pandemic affected not only children education and children in general, but also their families. Being children at home, not at school, with children being not at school, parents had to cope with their education. They have to take care of them. And in some cases, the pandemic also caused family losses, job losses, loss of social relations, social networks, and so on. So for this reason, we say that the pandemic has had and is still having an impact on children, families, and on the whole society. But the pandemic also taught us something. We learned that the traditional educational system are not prepared to respond to the crisis, to the pandemic and to other crises, but that it is necessary a change from a traditional educational system based only on physical access to school buildings to a new approach. That is the educational community approach. This approach insists on the necessity of involving many actors in children education, in supporting children education, not only schools and teachers, but also families, locally active stakeholders, civil society actors, and so on. And that it is important to combine in-presence activities with distance learning activities. Based on WeWorld experience on the field, we can say that this educational community approach is particularly efficient to respond to crisis and, for example, in the case of the pandemic, to the impact of the pandemic. In the report, you will find 5 country cases: India, Syria, Brazil, Tanzania, and Italy, where the educational community approach was applied and in some cases redefined to respond to the pandemic, to the crisis, and successfully. Going to the conclusion of my presentation, I mention here some of the recommendations we identify to face the pandemic, recommendations which are important in every education programs, but in particular in occasion of a crisis like this, of the COVID-19. In the report, you will find a more exhaustive explanation of all these recommendations, and here I quote some of them. And to conclude my presentation, I want also to remind that the WeWorld Index report will be today available on our website. That will be sent to those who registered to the event, and that in this edition we have a novelty. That is a dashboard. So in the report you can find also a link to the dashboard where you can navigate all WeWorld Index data, the data we used to create the WeWorld Index. With this, I conclude, and thanks for your attention. Thank you.
Thank you both, Elena and Marco, for your presentation and the opening speech. Now we have a short video, and after the video, we are going to take the discussion panel with our guests. Hello, welcome back. Now we start our discussion panel. As you can see, we have 4 guests for the panel, and I'm going to introduce them. I'm going to start with Mr. Mathieu Bonsard. He's the Chief of Education at UNICEF Office of Research Innocenti. And thank you, Matt, for being here. And he works for UNICEF since 2012, and he has a great, he's an expert of educational poverty. So we are going with him to analyze in depth this situation. So thank you, Mathieu Broussard. Then we have Mrs. Tiziana Clerico. She's the Protection Sector Coordinator at the UNHCR. Hi, Tiziana. And she's right now in Tunisia. And she has a great experience, 20 years of experience. Tell me if I'm wrong, with a non-governative organization. And she also served for 11 different operations in Africa, South America, Middle East, many headquarters, with all the population concerns. So I mean refugees, returnees, and internally displaced persons, and so on. From Ramallah, we have Mr. Rafat Sabah. He's the newly elected president of the Global Campaign for Education. So thank you for participating, Mr. Sabah. And he's also steering committee member in ED 2030, leading by UNESCO. So thank you for your participation. And last but not least, we have from New York, Mrs. Meg Gardinier. She's the Secretary General at Child Fund Alliance. So thank you, Meg, for your participation. And she has also very great experience in 25 years, I mean, in non-governative organization. And she's also specialized in women's and children's issues. So thank you, Meg, for being here with us. Now it will work like this. I ask one question each, and then you have at maximum 4 minutes to answer to my questions each, and then we will take another round of questions, and always you have 4 minutes to answer me. I really beg you to be in time because time is running out, okay? So thank you very much. As we know, child poverty is a widespread phenomenon all over the world, but maybe one of the worst aspects of the child poverty is for sure educational poverty. So to Mr. Drossard, I would like to ask, since COVID-19 actually impacted the educational system all over the world, I mean, could you please tell us, give more precise data about the impact that the pandemic had and will have in this field?
Can you hear me?
Yeah, perfectly.
So thanks, Cara, for the question, and thanks for the invitation. I'm delighted to be in this panel. I have the luck to be in the lovely city of Florence, where I lead the education unit of the UNICEF Office of Research, leading 20 quantitative and qualitative education researchers. First, I would like to really thank the group for the WeWorld Index. I think it's a fantastic contribution to policymakers at country level and to the global thinking of the global community. Very well articulated with the 4 building blocks and dimension: education, health, economy, and society. Very sensible, flagging the important challenge for women and children, even more so with COVID. And it is very consistent with the research we have done at UNICEF or with government and partners. Just even before COVID, a few stats. As we all know, we are in a time of learning, what we call a learning crisis, with learning poverty. The estimates we have is that 53% of children cannot read or understand a simple text by the age of 10. It's kind of heartbreaking. And in low-income countries, it's even worse. It's 9 out of 10 children who cannot read or understand a simple text by age of 10. And most of them are in school. They are in school, but they don't learn, basically. And with an equity and inclusion perspective, as Elena mentioned in the report, we know there is also the estimate we have 12 million girls that get married at early age every year. We also know that 50% of children with disability only go to school in low and middle income countries. So that's before COVID, and COVID, of course, exacerbated the crisis. As Elena mentioned, at the peak of the wave, of the first wave of the pandemic, 172 countries closed all their schools, affecting 1.5 billion learners. And even as today, there are still like 23 countries with schools still closed. We did a lot of research, including with partners, and we saw that there were very prompt government responses in all countries. Of course, with no one-size-fits-all. 4 modalities of remote learning solution were used by the different countries, online learning being one, TV and radio broadcasting educational programs, or in case there is not even electricity, paper-based take-home package and newspaper. High-income countries focus more, of course, on online learning, expansion of existing online learning, while the low-income countries had to find other solutions, including radio, TV, and paper-based package, basically. Many countries dropped non-core subjects, such as art, music, physical education, and it the poorest, the hardest. It's widened the inequalities due to the digital divide. Globally, only 24% of children were potentially reached by online learning solutions during school closures. At least 31% were not having any solution online or broadcast. It's like 463 million children. Even in Italy, we did recently research in Italy, 27% of families reported not having enough devices to support remote learning. So the challenges are huge. And an unprecedented crisis led actually to unprecedented collaboration. We have a good example with a joint report we just launched with UNESCO and World Bank called What Have We Learned? 149 countries from all over the world replied. On average, we have an estimate that a quarter of the school year was lost, more in some countries. And as already said by Elena, school closure had long impact on learning loss, risk of dropping out, nutrition, social cohesion, child labor, violence, and economic impact. The estimate from the World Bank is that we lost, due to school closure, up to $10 trillion of life cycles earning for this cohort of learners. If we look at now the reopening stage, because more than 3/4 of countries have fully or partially reopened school, low-income countries are reopening more face-to-face learning, while high and upper middle-income countries are more likely to use hybrid model with distance plus face-to-face learning. And most countries are planning to implement a wide variety of safety health measures as part of school reopening, but less than 1 in 5 reported plans to test COVID in schools. Maybe I will stop here, Chiara.
Yes, thank you, Matt. It was everything very clear. Thank you for your answer. We know that the 2020 edition of the WeWorld Index highlights how the countries at the bottom of the ranking will suffer most the indirect effects of the pandemic, despite the health crisis affected them to a lesser extent. But the repercussions of the crisis will be mostly felt by the most fragile categories, such as, for example, children and their education. To Mrs. Clerico, I would like to ask if she could give us an overview of the greatest risks that refugee children may face when it comes to their education in times of COVID-19.
Yes, first of all, thank you for inviting me to this panel, and then I will go immediately to answer to the questions. As has been highlighted already by Elena and Mathieu, COVID-19 is having a devastating impact on education worldwide, and I think all of us that have a child at home or in a school age teenager knows the impact that is having not only on him and her, but on the whole environment as well. In general terms, I think the pandemic has exposed the many inequalities and inequalities that the different education systems have. From access, as Mathieu said, access to broadband and computer needed for online education, to the supportive environment needed to focus on learning, up to the misalignment between resources and needs. Moreover, teachers also had to learn a new way of teaching, because from one day to another, we passed to online teaching, and some of the teachers were not prepared, didn't have the tools. And again, the school closure and the adoption of distance education is negatively affecting students' learning. First of all, because there is less time spent in learning because of stress symptoms, a change in the way students learn or socialize, lack of learning motivation, and lack as well of this socialization that is so important in the growth of these children and students, even more so when we're talking about refugees or other children of UNHCR concern. The negative effect of the closure, as highlighted by the Organization of the Economic Cooperation and Development, if it's already had an effect on all the children from privileged backgrounds can find the compensation because of the supportive family, of the supported learning environment, while children that come from disadvantaged background often remain completely out of these systems when the school, like in the case of COVID-19, shut down. And this is a pity, because especially in the case of displaced and refugee children, there were some programs and some advances that were made in all these years of efforts between not only UNHCR but the partners and the governments, and that risk to be vanished by this forced closure. And as has already been highlighted, while some countries are quickly adapting these new exigencies and switching to the online digital learning programs, many regions and many countries in the world, and mostly in those countries where refugees or displaced people live, do not have the means to adapt. So most of the refugees and host communities have limited access to the devices, hardware devices that are necessary, laptop, computers, mobile phones, or to the connectivity. And if the connectivity, the internet is available, sometimes is very expensive. So that puts at even greater risk these children already disadvantaged to lose precious moments on their education and available learning resources. UNHCR in September has launched a report that is called Coming Together for Refugee Education, in which it is highlighted exactly the impact that this COVID-19, this pandemic is having on refugee education, which is already not a very good overview if we look, because it is about not only the ability of the refugee child to go to school, but as well to the parents, to the environment to support them. In the case, for example, of parents, they don't have the livelihood. Let's not forget that in most of the countries, refugees cannot work. And so it means not having as well a steady income to provide not only to food and shelter, but as well to ensure the right to education to their children. So if we look at before the pandemic, for example, already refugee children were twice as likely to drop out of school or not being able to enroll in schools compared to non-refugee children of the same, or students of the same age. If we look at primary school, we are talking about a 77% of children, refugee children enrolled, which is already a good statistics. But then if we look at the secondary school, it drops to 31%, and it gets to a staggering 3% for tertiary and university education. And that, again, without counting, unfortunately, the girls, that has been highlighted, and I was listening to the national TV today, is not only in developing countries or countries with economies that are, it's like as well in advanced economies. Based on UNHCR data and Malala funds, we estimated that as a result of COVID-19, half of the refugees girls that are in secondary education will not be able or are not coming back to school. And if we look at countries where, for example, already the statistics of girls going in secondary school is less of 10%, we can easily see the chilling picture, which is the risk that none of these girls will be able to go back to school. And that will have a strong impact for generations to come.
Thank you a lot, Mrs. Tiziana Clerico. After the COVID-19 emerged, it has become very clear that certain challenges need to be global. I mean, and in particular, I talk about the importance of networks and addressing the issue of education in a cross-sectoral way that has been reaffirmed more strongly. To Mrs. McGardiner, I would like to ask if in her experience, what do you think are the strengths that a network must have to be effective in a field of education, especially in times that are hard like the times we are living in? We cannot, sorry, Meg, we cannot hear you. Thank you.
Hi, can you hear me now?
Thank you.
Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you for your question. And also, just once again, welcome, a big warm of welcome to WeWorld, who just joined Child Fund Alliance last week. We look forward to improving on our global advocacy efforts for children with WeWorld at the table. The question you raised is really important. I think the global development community has long recognized that education is like the fourth pillar of humanitarian relief. Whenever there's a crisis, education must be firmly implanted as a key priority, along with food, health, and shelter issues. With Child Fund Alliance, our network of 60 countries working, our network working in over 60 countries, we have 11 members, now 12 with WeWorld. We have developed a COVID-19 response plan, which looks at stopping the spread of COVID, addressing the needs of hunger, addressing the needs of safety and preventing violence against children, enhancing learning, but also another component that we've been focusing on this year, which is elevating the voices of children and youth. And that's what I think we bring in our network that's unique, in addition to all the other many important things, is that we engage young people to learn about their perspectives, how they're experiencing a dilemma such as COVID-19, but also asking them what they think we can do to improve things. This past year, one of our members, Aduca, which are headquartered in Spain, did an online survey in May of 4,000 children in Asia, Africa, Latin America, and they produced a report that's called "School is Shut, the Learning is On," and asked young people, what worries you most? And I don't think any of you will be surprised at the answers. They're worried about the fact that the shutdown has put enormous pressure on their families, that parents may lose income, that parents may get sick and people close to them may be ill. Of course, they miss their friends, they miss schools, they miss the places of worship, they miss all that highly relational aspect of being young that's just so critical to their development. But what we also discovered, I think, when we looked within the network about what we can learn, is that there's enormous optimism within our young people. And I think I'd like to just share two quotes with you, one from a young woman named Marie Curie in the Philippines. And she said, we don't always have to be afraid of everything in life. What we have to do is understand it. And another young fellow from Bolivia said, I know what we are all going through. It can be stressful, it can be boring, it can be repetitive. But since we're all at home, even if it seems endless, home is still a sea of possibility. It is a possibility for learning, teaching, and training. It's not the situation that's bad. It's the way we see it that's bad. It's not the virus that's bad. It's the way we relate to it. And that's what we learn a lot from young people, is how they perceive things. It's the framing of the moment that is so important. We're caught in a global pandemic for which there's no easy response until there's a global vaccine. We recognize that education is being disrupted. We know that education is being especially disrupted for children who live in the more rural, more considered marginalized communities. But what we're also hearing from young people is if they're with their family and people they love and they trust, that's a very important protective mechanism. And if we can work with the families to encourage them to keep as much education alive as possible through whatever modality there is, I think that's an important channel for us in enhancing educational outcomes. We had a very interesting experience with Child Fund this past couple of years where one of our members, Child Fund Australia, developed a Sports for Development initiative. And we've been using that Sports for Development initiative as a way to reach more young people through sports and recreation in very safe ways during COVID-19. So we have to think about the formal ways, the informal ways, and also those very safe moments with recreation that we can promote. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you a lot, Meg Gardiner. In the framework set by the 2030 Agenda, Sustainable Development Goal number 4 aims to ensure quality education for all. I'm going to ask a question to Mr. Refat Sabah, because I know he's very in a rush, because at 4 he needs to leave us. And so 5 years after the proclamation of the Sustainable Development Goals, some progress had been made, of course, especially in the education of boys and girls. But where were we before the COVID arrived, and what changed with the pandemic?
Thank you very much for your question. Actually, the information on the status of the SGD4 implementation clearly indicates that before the pandemic caused by COVID-19, the world was clearly out of the track. This is important to remember, to avoid the new excuse being used when verifying the global situation of education injustice. Evidently, COVID-19 made things worse. So much so that by the end of March 2020, 130 countries were keeping their schools closed, and 159 billion students were affected. Obviously, they were not affected the same. Countries and regions with technological advantage have enjoyed better conditions. And in those countries and regions where they don't have electricity, the situation worsened. This only shows that the pandemic is not democratic in the way it affects the population. people who have historically been discriminated against were most severely affected. To this panorama, we must add fear, which will have an ego in the measures of physical distancing, on which new canon of social relation could highlight the gaps and discrimination if we don't understand in time that the virus not only makes people sick or kills, but it can also turn everyday life into watertight compartments where no one wants to live with others. Within these 159 billion children, COVID-19 outbreak is affecting girls and boys, young women and men differently. Thus, policies and intervention responding to the outbreak should be equitable, gender sensitive, and transformative, protective of human rights, inclusive of the poorest and most vulnerable people in the society, including those with disabilities. In other words, responsive to different needs, contextual related and risk faced by individuals. Girls and young women, especially those who from marginalized community and with disability, will be particularly affected by the secondary impact of the outbreak due to their age, gender, social, economic, and other exclusion factors. Therefore, response measures must address their needs and rights, especially with direct attention to violence against women and girls, which has increased in many countries under lockdowns. This is my answer to the question.
Thank you a lot, Mr. Rifat Sabah. I'm sorry, since you need to go, I'm going to ask you the second question, so then you're free. What action has the global campaign for education taken, or does it intend to take to counter the backward steps due to the pandemic? And what are your requests to your donor?
Thank you very much for giving me the time to live. Actually, civil society organizations play a key role in supporting government through the crisis by helping to raise awareness about protective measures, spread official information, activate networks to support the most vulnerable sectors, facilitate the distance education and the production of teaching and learning resources. As the largest civil society organization, as a global movement, GCE is working for enhancing awareness on the impact of COVID-19 on the enjoyment of the right to education. GCE members and the Global Secretariat is also working on demanding states and international community to take action to protect the most vulnerable population, including teachers and caretakers. GCE main objective is to demand that education as a human right must be secured in the context of the current pandemic and as a key mechanism in the fight against the both immediate and longer term impact caused by COVID-19. The GCE recalls that education is an enabling human right, and at the same time it is a part of social protection structure that include the right to health, information, work, and comprehensive human rights, human safety. These rights cannot be ensured in isolation. The COVID-19 pandemic showed that the rate of economic growth will decrease globally, and that the crisis will increase geopolitical and technological rivalry. However, a projection on the social impact of the pandemic do not show key data about the terrible result it will have on people's life, and especially on the most vulnerable, and on pattern of poverty and inequality. The GCE further underlined that these difficult times must not further trends of commercialization and an instrumentalist approach to education. We are particularly worried about the risk related to the tool and platform used for online teaching and learning, including threats to the education as public good and the safety and integrity of students as well as teachers. At this time, strengthening public education system must be seen as an essential part of a more robust public response for protecting people's life and dignity, including the establishment of fair, progressive tax system, the closure of tax havens, and the end of tax avoidance. The GCE call on the national government and donors to prioritize education in all emergency responses with immediate effect, and to include education in their COVID-19 response policies, ensure the continuity of learning for all children, including those who are most disadvantaged and likely to be excluded, ensure distance learning is accessible to all learners, and support the containment of COVID-19 through raising awareness of WASH and social and behavior change. Prioritize the health, well-being, and safety of children and youth when designing any emergency measures, recognizing the mental and psychological toll of the crisis. Government must guarantee the continued provision of service, including meal distribution, protection from violence and exposure of abuse, and access to the sexual reproduction, health, and rights. To dedicate appropriate resources, financial and technical, to ensure the right of a free, quality public education for all is maintained during the COVID-19 crisis. All donor governments must meet the commitment of allocation at least 0.7% of the gross national income in official development assistance, and ensure that aid is not tied and channeled to most needed sector, including education. The external debt payment of low-income countries to all creditors must urgently be cancelled. To unlock fund in developing countries' budget and emergency finances should not put countries in higher risk of debt distress. Uphold and increase national education budget and ODA for education throughout the pandemic and the economic crisis to follow. Ensure that teachers continue to be at the center of the education response through their involvement in the design and development of emergency measures, as well as distance learning materials and broadcast, and are ready and supported to teach when schools and universities reopen, with their wages and employment maintained throughout the crisis. Many teachers and education support personnel are still working and must be adequately supported and protected. Ministries of Education and Finance should ensure the continued payment and benefit of teachers and the school staff during and after the school closure, to retain existing teachers and to ensure their expertise and knowledge is applied in distance learning strategy. Many development governments do not have the resources to respond to this threat. They enter into this crisis with a lack of health system coverage, social safety nets, and with less space to provide physical and monetary response to counteract recession. At the same time,
I'm sorry, I need to interrupt you because we need to make one more questions to Meg Gardiner, and then we need to let the Vice Minister intervene. I'm so sorry, but it was very interesting and very clear what you said. Thank you for being with us.
Thank you. Sorry.
Was very passionate. Really.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. I would like to come back with one more question to Meg Gardinier, and then we'll let the Vice Minister intervene with their speech. So Meg, I would like to know, how does the Child Fund Alliance operate in education, and what are the main interventions you think you need to implement in this field? The microphone. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Recognize that with COVID-19, we have to address new techniques for reaching young people, especially because of, as I mentioned earlier, this great rural-urban divide where a lot of young people don't have access to online learning. One of the things that's happened recently is that our member Aduko in Mali received a grant through Education Cannot Wait in collaboration with UNICEF to address the needs of children living in Mali who are at risk of losing some of their progress in education because of their IDP status. And what's hopeful here is that Aduko helped them with the completion of a certification exam for their educational credentials, and 100% of the young people did actually pass the exam. And so I think sometimes these short-term interventions through grants to target young people who are particularly vulnerable at a key moment and help them coalesce around an educational learning objective is really, really critical. And I would, I think building on some of the comments we're hearing earlier, the fact that the global community will make those funds and interventions available is really, really important and barely needed, especially in humanitarian context. I think across the board, what we're learning from our members right now is that they're trying to do a lot of initiatives that don't just focus on online learning, but also through video and radio messages, because not all of the young people that we have contact with have access to computers, but they do have access to radio. They might have access to television. And so some of the messaging and some of the educational techniques that we've employed have actually been through radio, through some of the non-traditional ways, because young people are at home. And then, as I mentioned earlier, with the Sports for Development work, we are finding that there are still opportunities for structured play with young people. And then the work that we've been doing in a program called Pass It Back, which is now moving over to a Sports for Development initiative in South Asia, has been a very useful opportunity for us to get messages out to young people about the importance of good hygiene, about some of the social and emotional needs that young people have in times of crisis, working, through those coaches to get information out to young people sort of in non-traditional ways. And then finally, I think, while this is not formal education, we're acutely aware of the psychological and social needs of young people during this time. And one of our clinics in PNG has been getting a huge increase in volume and calls during this pandemic, and we're trying again to staff up support at each one of these centers so that more people can be available to address the needs of children and families who are calling in. So those are just a few examples that I can share with you, but I could just say that we have to be very nimble at this moment. Quickly rethink what we're trying to accomplish and how we can best do it, working with the community, working with young people, engaging them to be part of the solution. And while we're, recognize the severity of the situation, we are seeing some opportunities where we've been making some progress that we can build on until such a time that we have a vaccine and all children can return safely to school. Thank you.
Thank you, Meg, a lot. Thank you very much. Now we take a little break from the panel because we need to introduce the Italian Vice Minister of Foreign Affairs and International Cooperation, Mrs. Emanuela Del Re. She will do her speech. Thank you for your participation, Minister, Vice Minister. the Italian Vice Minister of Foreign Affairs and International Cooperation, Mrs. Emanuela Del Re.
Thank you very much, Chair. I want to say that, of course, the COVID-19 pandemic is a truly global crisis, unlike any other before, which requires a comprehensive approach. And of course, it shows the inner links between public health, economic stability, and international security. To face it in the international community, of course, we need to put in place stronger efforts and actions. It is mandatory to act collectively in a coordinated and effective manner with all available instruments. The pandemic is affecting the most vulnerable groups that are already suffering from situations of poverty, marginalization, and other difficult socio-economic conditions. Women, children, young people, disabled persons, refugees, internally displaced persons, and migrants, amongst them, of course. Progress made throughout decades due to a collective commitment has been slowed down, and in some cases it has been put to an halt. This is further exacerbating existing inequalities and making the achievements of the Sustainable Development Goals of the 2030 Agenda more and more challenging. In the first 8 months of 2020, COVID-19 has forced the closure of schools in more than 190 countries. 1.57 billion children, adolescents, and young students are no longer attending the ordinary study cycles. Even before the pandemic, and despite the progress made, 258 million children and adolescents between the ages of 6 and 17 were out of school, 2/3 of them in sub-Saharan Africa and Southern Asia. Lack of access to education is affecting the youth, in particular teenage girls, considering that not attending schools entails very serious risks for them, including early and forced marriages. Over 150 million children could fall into poverty due to the pandemic. 23.8 million children are at risk at not returning to school, undermining decades of advancement in supporting access to education of girls, boys, and women. We must ensure that all national and international programs include full quality access to education for the most vulnerable, especially girls, as I said, refugees, IDPs. I tirelessly repeat the number and the name of those vulnerable groups. Since the Italian G7 presidency in 2018, when education featured prominently as a development priority, G7 countries fully committed to the goal number 4. It is our duty as Italians, as part of the global community, to keep the attention high on this issue. Although the crisis has spurred innovative approaches through distance learning, the United Nations has calculated that around 500 million children and young people have not had the opportunity to access digital distance education. To counter the effects of lockdowns in fragile countries not benefiting from technology, it is crucial to keep education as a top priority, both in terms of development cooperation financing and as national financing in developing countries. The Global Partnership for Education, UNESCO and UNICEF, as well as Education Cannot Wait, have spared no efforts to adapt their grants, financing, and programs to the new emerging needs. We need to sustain and support those efforts. Education will be our priority for the incoming Italian G20 presidency in 2021. We are focusing on our actions in the 2021 G20 presidency on the so-called 3P: people, planet, and prosperity. Education, of course, is a cross-cutting theme to all these three. The Italian Development Cooperation is actively engaged in promoting universal access to education, and we specifically focus on gender equality. That has, for us, a very powerful impact on economic growth while benefiting the whole society. As I mentioned earlier, in order to tackle violence, harmful practices, and gender discrimination, it is essential to guarantee access to education for all and create a safe environment for learning. This is why we raise communities' awareness on the importance of women and girls' lifelong education and help countries mainstreaming gender in their educational policies. Italy supports its partner countries creating an inclusive education system, especially for children with disabilities, by promoting their access to adequate learning spaces, by investing in teacher training, and by encouraging an active involvement from communities and families through awareness-raising activities. In its humanitarian emergency interventions, Italy pays particular attention to education. Education is key to ensure resilience of girls and boys affected by humanitarian crisis. Education means the future for these children because non-educated children are more likely to fall victim of radical propaganda while being less prone to develop the skills they need to build a future for their countries. Education plays a vital role, especially in contexts of emergencies and conflicts. Strengthening the effectiveness of the humanitarian response, reducing children's vulnerability, mitigating risk factors with respect to their protection, also contributing to the construction of a culture of safety and resilience, promoting social, economic, and political stability of communities. In 2019, the financial support of the Italian Agency for Development Cooperation in terms of humanitarian aid for the education sector provided for a total contribution of about 20 million euros. Italian Development Cooperation will continue its action to support initiatives aimed at guaranteeing inclusive and quality educational services covering all levels of education, from early schooling to primary up to university and postgraduate. It is a principle and a firm conviction of the Italian Development Cooperation that schooling, in addition to provide adequate education, helps promoting the inclusion, the inclusion of the most disadvantaged social groups and supports democratization and peace building. Schooling is a key socialization institution, and it is a point of reference for individuals and the community as a whole in terms of organization and coexistence. Within various funded initiatives, particular attention is given to the categories at greater risk of exclusion, such as young and teenage girls, students with disabilities, and minorities. We therefore need to strengthen our efforts on the ground to rehabilitate school infrastructures, provide school meals to help families, and find ways to provide education where infrastructures are lacking. Not only children. The pandemic has had a devastating effect on women, not only in developing countries. About 60% of women around the world work within the underground economy, often in conditions of exploitation, earning less than men, with a consequent reduced financial capability and higher probability to fall into poverty. Another serious effect of the pandemic is the increase in cases of home-based violence during the lockdown, not to be underestimated. According to UN Women data of 2020, 243 million women in the world have been victims of physical and/or sexual violence in recent months. The Italian Agency for Development Cooperation responded to UN Women's appeal, contributing to activities aimed at mitigating the impact of the crisis on women and girls. Supporting UN Women at this time, when gender-based violence is less likely to emerge and complaints are fewer, means supporting our strong commitments to human rights. These are the issues addressed by the Generation Equality, Realizing Women's Rights for an Equal Future campaign, launched this year by UN Women in the context of activities for the celebration of the 25th anniversary of the adoption of the Beijing Declaration and the Platform for Action. The Italian government considers the Beijing Declaration and the Platform for Action the blueprint for advancing women's rights and a more sustainable future for everyone, and remains fully committed to the platform's implementation. We will continue to back multilateral initiatives to eliminate harmful practices especially female genital mutilation and child, early and forced marriages. We are champions in this field. Italy commits to continued strong support to UN Women and the UN Population Fund by maintaining high level of national contributions to resources and programs. For more than 30 years, the Italian development cooperation has been a staunch supporter of the promotion of gender equality and of the empowerment of women and girls. Italian development cooperation through the agency and also the Directorate General on Development Cooperation continues working with partner countries to promote women's rights and female empowerment. The Italian Agency for Development Cooperation manages a portfolio dedicated to specific programs for the promotion of gender equality and the empowerment of women, amounting to approximately 96 million euros, of which 25% for the fight against gender violence, for a total amount of approximately 24 million euros. Italy commits to strengthening its efforts to prevent and protect women and girls affected by conflicts and post-conflicts from all forms of discrimination and violence, and to hold perpetrators accountable. Then Italy commits to contributing to the eradication of sexual violence in conflicts and post-conflict settings. Italy commits to protecting human rights of women, children, and the most vulnerable groups affected by conflict and post-conflict by helping to ensure their safety, physical and mental health, well-being, economic security, and equality. In conclusion, the current context presents pressing challenges. Global and multilateral actions must be taken to protect the most vulnerable groups, preventing the health crisis from turning into an education and gender crisis, and to build a new and effective model of sustainable development, enabling children, young people, and women to face the world of tomorrow in their best conditions. Thank you.
Thank you, Vice Minister, for your speech. It's been an honor to have you with us. And thank you very much so to the Italian Vice Minister of Foreign Affairs and International Cooperation, Emanuela Del Re. And now we move back to the discussion panel. I have still two questions for Mr. Brossard and Mrs. Tiziana Clerico. So I would like to start with Mr. Brossard. Hi, Matt. Thank you. Very quickly, after COVID-19 outbreak, school closures touched many children in the world, all over the world, as we saw. But some of them could at least count on the educated parents supporting them. So how much did the role of parents in children's learning as an equality amplifier count? I would like to know that from you.
Thank you, Chiara, and thanks to Minister Del Re for a very moving speech and for the commitment of the Italian government. I think it's a very relevant question you ask, and it's also a very tricky question. That being said, we have more and more data. 3 years ago, UNICEF started to include in their mixed household surveys surveys that are done with big samples in many countries that UNICEF supports. They started to include learning assessment tests, meaning testing the children from 7 to 14 years old in basic literacy and numeracy. And the same survey also includes a lot of information about the parents, the support they provide or not, and of course the assets they have at home and the poverty level or wealth level of each household. As we discussed before, in a time of COVID-19, we know that many households have not even electricity, and let alone a connectivity to internet. So in those situations, of course, the role of parents is even more important. Two factors that comes from the research we have been doing thanks to the mixed surveys. First, the importance of the books at home, child-oriented books availability. And there is huge difference across countries and within countries. If you look at Georgia, for example, a relatively rich country, 84% of households have child-oriented books at home, But if you look at the poorest household of Georgia, it's only 56 countries. And of course, the number are even worse in low-income countries. And support from parents, which is your question. For example, when parents are educated and can help their kids to and read them books, the books we talked about just before, it's not always easy, as you mentioned, because sometimes they are illiterate themselves because of the backlog of lack of education. A few numbers. Pakistan, Punjab region, poorest quintile household only, because that's the most important to take care when we are talking about the most marginalized. Only 15% of children can read, based on the test I mentioned before in the mixed survey, when their parents are not able to support them. When their parents support them, for example, reading book to them, it doubles up. It goes to 29% of children able to read at a sufficient level. And as Meg, the panelist, said before, it raises the importance of supporting parents and communities. For example, UNICEF is supporting many countries at country level with community engagement, community empowerment through its communication for development programs, and it has been, in some cases, successful. I don't know if I have more time, but just maybe one more point, if I am allowed, quickly.
Yes, of course. Please.
So of course, this support should also be linked in crisis time to psychosocial support and childcare that people have talked about before, even more important during the situation that we are all facing. And maybe the last point is about the monitoring issue. It's there's still a lot of progress to be made on monitoring learning and monitoring the learning loss and how kids are learning overall. And it's even more difficult when we are talking about TV or radio solution, or even more difficult with take-home package. So there were several attempts that were reported by some governments about using WhatsApp, text messaging to get feedback from parents during the lockdown. But there's still so much to be done, and things could be done. There is still evidence gap, for example, including on online solutions, digital solutions. We are working a lot with actually other UNICEF officers and Achilles Foundation on a platform that is used in Lebanon for Syrian refugees and in Greece for migrants, trying to apply a blended approach. And it starts to show good results, in particular because one, the tool, the language learning course, it's a language learning course on tablets for kids, refugees and migrants to learn the language of the host country. When it is with a strong pedagogical design from the outset, it works much better. IT tool itself doesn't work. If it is really with a right pedagogical approach, it works. Also, offline feature of the tools is super helpful, of course, in low or no connectivity settings. And importantly, for kids, having games like quiz, etc., also help children to learn. And the self-paced feature that some tools have is also helpful for children with disability or slow learners. And finally, the feedback, continuous feedback of teachers to improve the tools continuously is also a very key feature that our research shows as a game changer for successful solution that could be implemented even in difficult contexts, including in crisis context. Maybe I will stop here. I'm sorry I was maybe a bit long, but
very interesting. Thank you, Matthew. Thank you a lot. I have still one more question, and to Mrs. Tiziana Clerico. Sorry, Tiziana, for being waiting, for let you waiting a lot. But in the future, what are the best practices that should be implemented? I mean, to safeguard the education of these children. And so we were talking about the refugee children, even in case of a new emergency, because we know that it's very likely that we can leave another emergency, maybe not a health emergency, but any other kind of it.
Thank you for the question. Well, I think that the pandemic has taught us a valuable lesson that I hope all of us will retain and apply, which is that we need to start investing in the present if we want to have a future. So that is the first lesson I think that all of us has to learn. And then, as you correctly said, the most likely will be other contexts, so other crises. So we definitely try to learn from what we are living now to make sure that we are better prepared when another crisis strikes. And this is why, again, the accent on prevention is fundamental. So learning from what we are living now, not to repeat perhaps the same mistakes if another crisis strikes, not only for refugee children, but I think for all of us in general. And then, of course, UNHCR and its partners have continued to adjust during this year and learning as well, while trial by error and trial as well, and see what was working. And one element that Mathieu already highlighted is definitely to go and talk with the communities and having community outreach, because one lesson learned from the previous crisis, the Ebola crisis, is that it's important to ensure that communities remain informed about the education opportunities, school reopening, epidemic, and anything that is happening, because we don't have to forget that refugee communities not always are perfectly integrated in the community tissues and most likely do not speak the language of the hosting country. So we have to make sure that messages are developed in a language that the children, the students, and the parents can understand as well. And then what we can think, something that as UNHCR we would like to propose, but is not only for refugee children, is really for all of us and all the children everywhere, is investing in school and infrastructure, as we said, preventing before responding when it's sometimes too late and with too little. And material, not only infrastructure in terms of buildings, but as well providing the teachers with the skills and the knowledge that they need to be fit for purpose, to be fit for the challenges that this century and education is asking them. So give them the tool and the skills to be better teacher. And then I think, as Meg said, important as well, listen to the students, listen to them and build a new future and their presence together with them, because they know they are resourceful, they are optimistic, and sometimes they have ideas that we cannot imagine, and they can help us really to help them to build their own future and make them really responsible and having ownership of what this future is. And then reduce, as well, other panelists were saying, the territorial inequalities in the availability of public goods. Again, let's not forget that most of refugee parents do not have the right to work. If we want to ensure that parents have an environment which is conducive to fulfill their obligation vis-a-vis their children's rights of education, we have to provide that. So what we would suggest is identify available resources with open licenses, as well as tools for virtual learning. UNHCR is already working with partners in making sure that we update all available digital resources and tools for students and teachers to use. Aligning resources to national curricula. Again, UNHCR is collaborating with partners like Learning Equality to map and align open digital resources to different national curricula to their free open source platform, which is called Colibri. And so, for example, in 2019, UNHCR, together with Google.com, Learning Equality, Vodafone Foundation, and UNESCO, convened a hackathon in the Google offices in San Francisco, in which the all aims was to prototyping a set of tools that allows to automate aspect of a curriculum and they support curriculum alignment in emergencies and crisis contexts. So we mitigate the disruption that the crisis can have on education and show how can potentially be integrated with policy work and to strengthen cohesion around existing projects. Again, not only for refugee children, but as well to all of those that use open the educational resources. Building digital literacy among students and parents. Again, what applies to children, teachers applies as well to parents. I'm a 1.0 woman because I'm from another generation. We all know we are not born in the digital technological world. So we need to provide as well parents with the skills that is necessary to support their children. Assisting educational and educators with instructional instructional designs. So needs to support how to best support digital learning. So we work again with governments to equip educators and with skills for effective connected education, make sure that there is free online available and free connectivity. So investing as well in digital infrastructure and access to digital infrastructure to refugee children, computers, mobiles, platform, anything that can help them to really take advantage as well of alternative means of education when education in person cannot be possible, and free connectivity. And last but not least, provide guidance on the use of connected education. So we all learn a lot on how to support the digital resources with virtual learning approaches. We collaborate with the Connected Learning in Crisis Consortium that helps to outline promising practices for tertiary approaches and aims to promote, coordinate, collaborate, and support the provision of quality education, because important for children is not only to go to school, but to have quality education. And this is where we measure really the success in achieving the Sustainable Development Goal. It's not just only education, quality education. So to finish, I think that keeping education going in a time of a pandemic requires resourcefulness, innovation, invention, and collaboration. So we all have a lot of work to do ahead of us. Thank you very much.
Thank you to you, Mrs. Tiziana Clerico. Thank you a lot. Time really runs out, and so time is over. And I thank all the participants to the panel, and also Marco and Elena for their introduction. Unfortunately, we don't have time to the questions from the public. I'm so sorry, but I would like to remind you that for any doubts or curiosity, or if you want to study in depth all the data that has been into the WeWorld Index 2020, you can find it, and you can download it from the WeWorld Onlus website. And there is, from this year, as Elena said, there is also a dashboard inside, and you can use it to analyze in depth all the data that you're interested in. Thank you very much. I would like personally thank Marco and Elena and all the staff from WeWorld Onlus, because they invited me, and it was a great experience for me. And I would like to thank all the panelists and also the Vice Minister of Foreign Affairs International Cooperation. Thank you very much.